There's this new song called Stairway to Heaven. You may have heard of it once or
Yeah,
twice.
it might be an okay song. It might stand the test of time. I don't know. Again, they're great songs. I'm not dissing the songs at all. It's just that these bands have so many incredible songs in their catalog, and I just there's those every one of them has those 2 or 3 that were carved out and branded the classic songs, and I get it. But for me, it doesn't get me excited. To me, classic rock just means the cream of the crop, the most enduring stuff. But what's frustrating for me about it is that it's not, for my personal taste, a wide enough net. I just wish it would be a little bit more adventurous. I just wish that people who programmed it or loved it would look deeper into these artists' catalog. I think that so many of these artists that are deemed classic rock, you say to the person on the street, you rattle off Thin Lizzy, and they're going to say the boys are back in town. But unfortunately, they're not going to know about the other amazing songs and albums that band has. Mm-hmm. Why? Because classic rock doesn't play them. A lot of it is that people just live with what they've been force-fed, and they don't take the initiative to look a little deeper and say, okay, maybe there's other songs, maybe there's other tracks if we like that period from a band. And that leads into a whole nother conversation, but something else that's happening with classic rock bands that is the newest, most emerging thing, and that is them becoming brands instead of bands. And what I mean by that is you're seeing a few instances where you have bands on the road with one, sometimes no original members who actually created that music. But what do they have? They're playing the songs, and they have the rights to the name and the logo. And some people, in some instances, don't care. I'm hearing these great songs, I don't even care who's actually playing them for me. A band like Foreigner has set a huge precedent that a lot of people are taking notice of right now, where they have been touring for a while now with 0 original members. But Foreigner is so synonymous with classic rock and had so many incredible songs, but they were also somewhat of a faceless band. It wasn't really about who was in the band, it was just about the songs, and the songs continue to live on and people still love them to this day. So they don't look all that close. Oh wow, Foreigner's playing? Those songs are great, I'm going to go see them. And they get there, it's like, oh wow, Lou Graham's not singing them? Well, this guy sounds great. We're cool with this. So as classic rock evolves and younger people come out and want to see these bands live, the artists who actually made it can't do it anymore. Either their skills have eroded, they can't sing anymore. Unfortunately, some of them aren't with us anymore. But that's not going to stop the classic rock machine from still moving, because now they're actually bringing in all these replacement members, and if they can sell it to the people, they're going to sell it. And they're going to have that entity known as Foreigner playing and continuing to tour and bringing in a whole new fan base to follow them. Foreigner this summer opened for Kid Rock. So there's a newer, younger audience compared to Foreigner, hearing this band called Foreigner that most of the time had no original members, just playing great songs. So it's just another way to reinvent and keep this classic rock machine rolling. And a lot of people have taken huge notice to what Foreigner has done and the success they've had with it, and trying to figure out if they can do it. And you mentioned Kiss before, they've halfway done it. They're going to replace all of those guys with people impersonating the original band. And that's going to happen sooner than later, and they're going to market a sanctioned tribute. Some people are going to buy it. I was just on the phone yesterday with Ricky Medlock, who plays in Lynyrd Skynyrd. He used to have a band called Blackfoot that was big in the classic rock world. He's putting out a new version of Blackfoot. He's not even going to be in it. He's going to go and put all these young guys out playing his songs and kind of sanction it. Just another way to reinvent and turn over this catalog and appeal to the classic rock fans.
Do you think that heavy metal belongs in the story of classic rock?
Sure, but I think what happens is when a heavy metal artist or song gets embraced by classic rock, it kind of mainstreams it out to some degree. It's not so metal anymore.
Yeah.
You talk about AC/DC. It's kind of like hard to think that something like You Shook Me All Night Long at one point was considered some sort of metal thing. I'll give you an example. When I got into radio, I started radio in '83, and when I got into radio, I wanted to do something called a metal show on the radio. Nobody was really doing anything like that at the time. There's only maybe one or two other ones. And I was working at a record store. And it was across the street from the radio station. And the owners of the store would come in all the time. And I was selling records. This was '83. I was selling records from 3 bands that they weren't playing, that they weren't touching on the radio.
Which bands were these?
Def Leppard, who had just put out Pyromania.
Oh.
Quiet Riot, who had just put out Metal Health. And the first Metallica record.
Kill 'Em All?
Kill 'Em All. And all these records were selling and doing well, but radio wouldn't touch them. And when the owners would come in, I'd say, hey, how come you guys aren't playing this stuff? And they would be like, oh, that's, we don't do heavy metal on the station. We can't. It's too alienating, whatever. So I said, but we're selling tons of it. I'm here selling. People are buying it. They must want to hear it. No. So that's the way I got my show on the air, was by pushing them to give me an outlet to play this stuff. They said, okay, we'll give you 3 hours a week, come up and play it. Now, that's '83. If you flash forward and you think to yourself, 2 of those records for sure, Metal Health and Pyromania, went on to sell millions and millions of records shortly after that. Now, there's songs from both of those records that are considered to be classic rock songs.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, they were songs that they were so abrasive that they didn't know what to do with them. But as my point is that as time goes on, mm-hmm. this stuff is viewed under a different lens. It's looked at differently, and it's looked at like, well, it's stood the test of time. It's not so abrasive anymore. There's people that like it. It's grown. It's like it's taken on a whole new life. It's looked at in a whole different way. But I think what happens is every once in a while you have these metal acts that cross over and become so big that then they have to become accepted by classic rock. Great example of that would be Metallica with something like Enter Sandman. Eventually, if not already, that is considered classic rock, and that does get played on classic rock radio. That's the only Metallica song that's going to get played on classic rock, but it's become so big that where once it was considered a metal thing, now it's considered a classic rock thing. It happens all the time, and it really just speaks to the way these songs hold up and how the lens they're looked at in 20 years on after they've come out. And if it's looked at as something that's still stood the test of time and that was impactful enough at the time, okay, we can start to kind of spoon feed that to the classic rock audience. And I think that's really all that it's about. I think when you look at the umbrella of classic rock, you're going to find everything from, Love is a Battlefield by Pat Benatar, which is basically a pop song, to You Shook Me All Night Long, to Welcome to the Jungle, to Crazy Train. Crazy Train is certainly metal. It was considered metal when it came out. It's a metal song. But it's now accepted by classic rock, and to me it just becomes a rock song. So it's not about, I think when you get into the realm of classic rock and you become, a song reaches that sort of level, the categories that originally existed in are thrown out. Doesn't matter anymore. It's just, now it's classic rock. The band could still be considered metal or what have you, and it might be the only song that makes it into that sort of umbrella, but when you get to the point of it being classic rock, it's just classic rock at that point. You've arrived, there's been enough put into it that it's like enough research done, enough acceptance to the song that it's like, okay, this is just classic rock now.
Where does that border begin between metal and, hard rock?
Well, it's a good question because I think that there is a difference between the two. Some people don't make a distinction. Some people just kind of put it all under one umbrella. That happened a lot in the 80s where people were like, everything from Def Leppard and Poison to Metallica and Megadeth were all just considered and called heavy metal. Even to this day, you'll see shows, TV shows that are, you know, Metal Mania Hour or whatever on VH1 Classic or whatever, and you'll see Bon Jovi in there, and you'll see Megadeth in there, and you'll see Anthrax in there, and you'll see Poison in there. It still goes into that big sort of melting pot, and I think that's one of the things that's caused it some problems, because there is a distinct difference. To me, hard rock has more melody to it. It is more accessible, and it's just really rock music with just maybe a little bit more edge in the guitars. Metal, a lot of what makes metal to me is the presentation, and there's a lot more aggression in it. And visually, it's completely different. So it's very hard for me to put into words, but you can rattle off a band to me, and I'll tell you right now, in my view, are they hard rock or are they metal? And to me, it's very clear cut. I don't know why, maybe just from doing this my whole life, I just kind of make it, in my mind, there's an immediate distinction. In my opinion, AC/DC was always a hard rock band. And the reason why I say that is because so much of what they do originates from a blues-based structure. To me, they're just a hard rock band. I'll tell you, Motorhead, when you come to a band like Motorhead, Lemmy will fight you on being called heavy metal. And he's a guy that people consider to be like one of the founding fathers, like an icon of heavy metal. And he does not consider himself or Motorhead to be heavy metal. He considers it to be a loud rock and roll band. Every time they come on stage, we are Motorhead, we play rock and roll.
What is the importance of the dual guitar to the identity of heavy metal?
I think that visually and sonically, it gives the impression of more guitars, louder guitars, you know. Visually, you're seeing two guys with double the amount of guitars. And sonically, there's two guitars going on to here. Whether they're dual lead guitars or whether they're rhythm, and it just makes for a beefier, bigger sound. And most metal bands embrace that. Yeah, there's another thing here that is just, I have to remember, because I'm so close to this, and I've worked in this business my whole life, and because I'm around music constantly, there's another thing about this whole classic rock thing. At the end of the day, it's really good stuff, you know, and I think that you can analyze it and rip it down and do all this sort of research about it, but at the end of the day, the real quality about it is it's really great. You know, it still sounds great to a lot of people. It still moves people. And whether they're new people just discovering it who are younger, or the people who grew up with it as it goes, there's a reason why it still endures, because it's great. I may be sick of it. You know, I may personally, a lot of it, not need to ever hear again, but I live it. I have to take myself out. I have to put myself in the perspective of the guy who doesn't live it, of the guy who has a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday job, and when he gets in his car at 5 o'clock to go home, he wants to hit the preset, and he damn well wants to hear Walk This Way, because he knows it. It's like a warm blanket. It's like, okay, I'm good now, you know. I don't, because I look at it from a different perspective. I was the guy who's delivered that to people. It's like, oh, I can't hear it ever again. But to people, it feels good, it is good, and it's what they want. And if you can bring in younger people into that world, great, through playing some of the current bands. Because the older people that grew up with it are they're gonna die with it. They're staying with it the whole way. It is turning over that demographic. And it's no coincidence that a lot of these bands are still the biggest money grabbers on the road, because people want to hear those songs, and then they play those songs, and now you're 50 and you're bringing your kids to the show, or you're 40 and you're bringing your kids to the show, and suddenly they're getting into the songs.
Are there certain elements that need to be present in a rock band to even be considered classic rock?
Well, they have to be rock, and they have to again, they have to endure. They have to stand the test of time. They have to have made such important albums or songs that connect with the artist, connect to the audience in a way that it takes them back into that place and time. And it's got to be immediately identifiable, and it's got to have a certain sound and feel that captures that and pulls the audience in. A lot of what classic rock is about is a trip down memory lane, is making people feel good, giving people memories of what it was like when they first heard that song. So yeah, and within the boundaries of classic rock, it's a pretty wide net as far as some of the sounds and styles that you'll hear. You'll get everything from AC/DC to Manfred Mann to Moody Blues. There's a wide net, but it all kind of falls into that same sort of thing. It's like, wow, I remember when that came out. That was really cool. I think a lot of what classic rock is taking the listener back to a place and time when that music came out, and making them feel good and making them feel like they felt when they first heard or got that music. And that is really one of the big keys of what classic rock is all about. It's a trip down memory lane. If you're 50, it puts you in the headspace of when you were 20. And everybody wants to be younger and everybody wants to be a kid again. So I think that plays a huge, huge role. As every 10, 15 years go by, it has to evolve, it has to move forward, because otherwise, classic rock becomes what's known as oldies. There's a whole nother format here, oldies. My parents grew up in the 50s. They like what they call the oldies. And that's a format in America as well, the oldies format, playing Elvis Presley and playing 50s music. And you need to move it forward. And this is getting into a whole nother conversation, but one of the things that makes classic rock from a radio standpoint so appealing to radio stations is that it appeals to a very desirable demographic, and that is men between the ages of, say, 30 and 50 years old. That is a key demo for advertisers, because that's what people that have money and are at a point in their life where they have families and money and they want to spend that money and they have things they need to spend it on. So you need to stay in that demographic, because you don't want to get too much younger than that. You don't want to get too much older than that, because people's priorities change and how they want to spend money and what appeals to them changes. So it's very important, and that's one of the reasons why classic rock has to move the needle forward and start eventually playing 80s, and then after a certain point start playing 90s and keep moving that forward, because if it doesn't, the fan base will just keep growing with it and it becomes too old. And when you become too old, you lose the sellability to the advertisers. So there's a whole business behind the classic rock model as well. And if you if you grew up with Soundgarden and Nirvana, well, if you grew up with those artists, you're probably around 40 years old right now. So as a result, you're starting to see Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, certain tracks pop up in classic rock radio. The biggest problem that's happening now is the number one thing that I see happening as a byproduct of the internet and a byproduct of, and as a result of the internet, the record companies basically going away for the most part, let alone record stores. I mean, I've got this whole other feeling about everything. I grew up working in a record store, and I still am a huge fan of physically owning music. I'm still a huge fan of CDs. I still want my music that way. But I think that what's happened because of the internet and everything is that we've lost, with most people, any desire to have physical ownership of music. It's a stream, it's a file, it's something that they just pass around, and it's completely devalued music, in my opinion. Again, you can trace that back to the internet. The other big problem that I see is complete oversaturation. Because of the demise of record companies, you don't have any gatekeepers anymore for what's good and bad. Basically, if you had a band or you made a record, mm-hmm. if you got a record deal and you physically could hand somebody a record, and I could say, here, Daniel, here's my new record, here's a CD, and you got it, and you're like, wow, the whole idea of owning and holding and looking at something and photos and the booklet. Well, I just think that it comes down to a case of oversaturation. I just think that there's too much out there for people to process. There's no gatekeeper. There's no filter. There's nothing stopping people from creation to delivery. And again, some may look at that as a very positive thing, and for creativity it is. But for fans to disseminate what's real and what's not, it makes things very, very difficult. The record company structure has collapsed, so A&R people and all that sort of stuff are gone, and you have all these outlets. Anyone can make a video with their iPhone. Anybody can make music with their computer. Anybody can deliver that music through the internet. So again, there's no barriers, and for every positive that brings, there's also a bunch of negatives. It makes it way harder to stand out from the crowd. It makes it way harder to get attention. And there's nobody saying to these people, hey, your songs aren't good. Hey, your band's not good. You're not ready to be putting stuff out. Who cares? The market's just flooded and flooded. And for the consumer, the fan, it dilutes stuff. And it makes it very difficult. There are record companies that are, put out 30 records a month. They don't do anything for them. The bands never will last past a week, but they're just pumping stuff into the system, and it just dilutes it and crowds it. And for fans, they don't know what's real and what's not anymore. We're also in a time where everyone, because of social media, it's so PC. Everyone is so hypersensitive to criticism. Everybody wants, you say the slightest little thing. It always amazes me. People will say to me all the time, hey, we really want to know what you think of this band. And they'll pound me on it, whether it's on Twitter or whatever. And what do you really think of whatever band? Okay, you want to know, here's what I think. And I'll tell them. Just my opinion. And if they don't agree with that opinion, then suddenly it's like they go crazy. Like, Eddie was shit talking this band, and then it's like whoa, and then it becomes this domino and this snowball that rolls. And by the end of the day, it became, Eddie said you should be decapitated. It's like, no, I didn't. No, I just said I didn't care for the band. But that's this sort of social media machine that has perpetuated in this. Everyone's looking for that angle, that person to slip up. It's just also another huge diversion from music. Whereas when I was a kid growing up, when a record was released, that was a huge day. You cared about, you stood in line at the record store. It was you checked your calendar for that day. You wanted that record the day it came out. You wanted to hold it. You wanted to open it. You wanted to smell it. You wanted to look at it. You wanted to see if, as a big Kiss fan, first thing I'd do when I would get a record back in those days is I'd open the cellophane on the side and I'd shake it like this, because there would always be stuff stuffed in the album jacket. Flyers to buy more Kiss junk, or, a tattoo or a poster or something. Like, wow, it's going to come out. You were so connected. That was your world. You stood in line to get the concert ticket. You stood in line when the record came out. You had that record. You looked at it all week. You played it. You became connected with it. That's all gone now. That going away is so important to the devaluation of music now. And then you factor in the fact that because of technology, everything is on demand, everything is immediate, attention spans are so much shorter, you want it quick, you want it how you want it, and as a result, it's just created this thing where like a record comes out and a new band comes out, and in a week they could be forgotten about already, because there's no artist development either. I still, to this day, on both of my radio shows, play new music from new bands, but also new music from classic rock bands. The problem is, a lot of these bands make new records. A lot of these classic rock bands make new records. Some of them are really good. The challenge for them is to get people to know or care that they've made new music, because by and large, nobody cares about it. They all want to just hear the hits, the old stuff that they know and love. That to me has always kind of sucked, because I like the bands that I grew up with. I like to see where they go and grow and how they evolve and how they change. But classic rock, if anything, if there's a negative connotation to it for me, is the fact that it's just so stuck in one era. it's so stuck in one thing. It doesn't continue the lineage of what these bands do. And a lot of them have made some really good records that have been completely ignored because by and large classic rock does not play new music at all. And I think that's a problem. So I always play new music from new artists that I like and new music from classic rock artists that's still good, because I think it's important to move the whole thing forward as far as just being living in one decade or stuck in one decade. I think it's important to continue to progress. And people say to me all the time, why do you think that? And I said, well, I think about in '83 when this new band came to me called Metallica that nobody ever heard of. Yeah. And I played them. And I'm glad that I did. I'm glad that I could say I truly did. In 1989, this band came to me called Skid Row. That was from here in New Jersey. Hey man, will you play our record? We just got this new singer named Sebastian Bach. Will you check out our record? I have the tape of playing it. So yeah, okay, sure. That's a new band at the time. That wasn't classic rock. And then what happened with them? So it's always cool when you can see that arc and see where bands that are considered now. I've been fortunate. I've been in this business long enough that bands that are considered classic rock now, I was actually there at their birth. I saw that happen. I saw Guns N' Roses play the Ritz in '87 when Appetite came out. Before that was classic rock. So it's cool when you can look back and have that perspective and realize how important it is, at least I think, to still, as long as, of course, you love and you embrace all the old stuff, but to also keep an eye on what's happening going forward.
We're in such a different time because everybody's attention's in so many different places. Unfortunately, the biggest thing I regret as a music fan is that music doesn't have the same amount of importance placed on it as it did to fans that grew up with 70s, 80s, or even 90s music. Music is delivered differently now. It's not viewed as this sort of super important thing. You used to line up and wait for your favorite record to come out and go to the record store and buy it. You'd listen to the radio hoping that they were going to play that song. You'd wait on MTV to hope to see that video come up. All that's gone now. It's just like, it's on demand. It's like, okay, somebody put out a record. Oh, I'll click on YouTube. I'll listen to the stream. I don't know. Maybe I'll buy the download. Maybe I won't. I mean, it's just disposable now. It's just, it blows my mind that people put out new records and I see all this build up to it for like a month, and the record is literally dead and forgotten within a week of its release. It's like it never even came out because it's instant satisfaction. It's let's just get our fans who care, get everybody to buy it in the first week, and then they give up trying to sell it beyond that because people don't have the attention span for it anymore. Really bums me out. It's something that it's hard for me to come to grips with as somebody who grew up and still loves buying music, owning music, grew up working in a record store. The biggest thing I can say in a nutshell is the relationship with music and most of the younger fans is completely different than it would have been with somebody as recently as just 10 years ago. With the introduction of music videos, the biggest change is that it all became very quickly about image. It was very much about what you looked like. It was very much about if you had a good-looking lead singer. It was very much about your hair, your outfits, your styling. That became a huge, huge issue. And I know for a fact, I worked for a record company and at that time, and we would go out and look for bands, and I would talk to people at other labels, and I'd be like, yeah, I went to see this band or I went to see that band. And instead of the questions being about, well, how did they sound or what was their writing like, or was it like, well, what did they look like? That was immediately something that became a huge thing because what people realized was pretty quickly was like, hey, if they don't have songs, well, we can get them some songs. If they can't play that well, we can use some session guys in the studio to make the record. So that became a big thing. It's like, well, but if we got, guys that are great performers and look great, we can we can fix everything else around it. So the visual of what MTV did and how impactfully that sold records, which I witnessed firsthand, is something that completely turned the industry on its head. Back in those days, you got your video on MTV, you got it in the countdown shows, there were these countdown shows, Dial MTV, and all these nightly countdown shows. If you got your video in that top 10 countdown every day and you had a record in the store, then radio followed TV. That was the first time that really happened. Radio followed TV. Then all of a sudden you're getting video airplay. Then you go to the record companies would go to the radio stations and say, hey, we got this many airings on MTV. And then radio would start to consider playing you. It used to work the opposite. MTV and video was so powerful that you get on MTV, radio had to come to the party. Happened many times. There were a lot of bands that benefited from a lot of video airplay where the videos were actually bigger than anything in their history. Quiet Riot were the first band to be a metal band to have a #1 record. And I think a lot of that was driven by MTV with Come On Feel the Noise and Metal Health. But it even went back further than that. I mean, early MTV artists that had huge success with videos, people like Billy Squier, even like for the first time in America, Triumph was seen on MTV. They were a 70s band, but all of a sudden people were starting to see Triumph, and 10 years into their career, they had this whole renaissance in America because they were the early adapters to MTV, and they had some old concert clips and they put them on. So even before Quiet Riot, I think to a large degree, Def Leppard, probably in my opinion, the most synonymous band with music videos and MTV success. You can't get Bon Jovi, can't get bigger, and for that matter, Twisted Sister. Those are bands to me, all of them that come to mind is just in lockstep with the success of MTV playing their videos, and that being the driver for radio play and concert ticket sales and everything else. I'm waiting for rock radio to embrace what I think is a really, really underserved audience out there. And that is people who grew up with 80s rock music. By and large, they're getting ignored. You're going to be shoveled either 70s or shoveled 90s. There's this huge section sitting there that isn't being served. And that's why you see the success of these sort of festivals and cruises and events, because it's a community sort of thing. It's just like, okay, this is our stuff. This is what we got into. But it's all relative to how old you are.
So do you think that if like a young band comes out that captures that 80s feel, would that blow up? Do you would that be possible?
No, I don't believe, well, hard to say. I honestly don't know how any band blows up today. I really don't. Yeah, I mean, I think that the visual end of it was a huge, huge part of what, there's a lot of terms for that era of music. A lot of people use the term hair metal, which I personally don't like, and I don't use. But I just prefer to call it 80s hard rock, and that's what I think it was. I think that every era has its fashion. If you look at the 50s, guys were wearing pompadours and jackets and whatever. If you look at the 60s, maybe it was kind of like a hippie thing with tie-dye. The 70s, it was bell-bottom jeans and whatever. 80s, it was big hair and spandex. 90s, it was flannel. Every era of music has a look. I never really understood why the 80s had to be defined by the look as opposed to the music. Just like anything, there were good and bad bands in every decade. But the look became so major because of MTV, because these guys were plastered all over MTV. A guy like Kip Winger, who was a poster child for, to a lot of people, what was wrong with the 80s and the looks department as far as the style over substance thing, couldn't be more opposite. Kip's to this day, is one of the most talented people out there. I mean, the guy knows how to play classical music, and I mean, even Winger back in the 80s was light years better musicians than any of their peers for the most part. But because of their look, they got pigeonholed as, for whatever reason, took the biggest hits. So it was very unfair, and it remains that way to a lot of bands, unfortunately. But a lot of it was driven by MTV. That's why if you go one step beyond classic rock, and maybe this will be your next film, and look into what's called oldies, you'll be shocked to see that a lot of what classic rock radio plays is also played on these oldies formats. Now, they don't call it, they've rebranded a lot of it and don't call it oldies anymore because now there's a little bit of a stigma towards that. But, so it all comes down to a generational thing. To me, the only timeline for classic rock to me, it's very personal. It really just depends upon how old you are, what you grew up in, what you grew up being exposed to, and it's very generational. What a radio station may view as classic rock is probably very different than what an individual looks at as classic rock. I believe it's completely down to demographics. And I think that classic rock has to turn over, has to evolve, and has to just move forward. I think that for a lot of people, maybe a little younger than me, their era of classic rock are the 80s bands. I can't tell you how many 80s themed festivals I host every year, or cruises, or things like that. And it's all geared, most of it, towards 80s oriented bands. And the reason for that is because if you're between 35 and 45 years old, that was your classic rock. Your classic rock wasn't Derek and the Dominoes. Your classic rock wasn't Eric Clapton or the Grateful Dead. It was Whitesnake. It was Def Leppard. It was Bon Jovi. That's what you grew up with. Now, you may have gone back and discovered earlier stuff through your parents or what have you, but that's the stuff that struck a nerve with you. Rat, another huge MTV band. You know, bands like that. And the disconnect, which is really strange when it comes to classic rock radio, is by and large, they've ignored a lot of those bands in mainstream radio play. There's a little Def Leppard, maybe an occasional Whitesnake song. Certainly Bon Jovi has crossed over into pop now. But for the most part, all these bands, you're never going to hear Winger. Maybe you'll hear Round and Round by Rat. But there's so many bands that had these huge careers, Cinderella, what have you, on MTV. They rarely get played to this day on classic rock radio. Classic rock radio, again, it goes back to that stigma I talked about. They almost jumped right over the 80s and went from the 70s right to the 90s. You'll hear more Pearl Jam and Soundgarden on classic rock today than you'll ever hear of the 80s MTV era. It was very stigmatized, wrongfully so, but very stigmatized. Every sporting event coming out of a timeout, the players walk out, they play Crazy Train for whatever reason. It's the introduction theme, just like Welcome to the Jungle. There's so many teams. So that mainstreams it out. It gets so ingrained in the consciousness of people. It's just like, oh, that's just, it becomes classic rock as opposed to what it started out, which was metal. So it's just stuff that happens over time, shows up in movies, shows up in sporting events. You know what, I never really played that song before on my radio show. I'm going to start playing it. Maybe that happens 25 years ago. And then they play it. And then the next guy, the competing radio station in town says, wait a minute, he's playing Crazy Train now? He's doing well with playing that? I better play it. The music industry, like many industries, is incredibly copycat. So if they see success somewhere, everybody's going to try to imitate it and duplicate it. It only takes a couple people to take the risk, and then others will just jump on. And if they have success with it, they'll chase it. I love classic rock, but I also feel that it's so important for fans and for the industry and everybody to also look at what's next. Don't close off the world. Don't let your thinking of what music was end at 1986. There was great music. My favorite era for music personally is the 70s, followed very closely by the 80s. But that doesn't mean I still don't stop looking and exploring and playing and supporting and searching for new bands, because there's tons of them that have that flavor. And they need help and support too. So I just wish people would be a little bit more adventurous, because this music we're not in the 70s, we're not in the 80s, we're not in the 90s. It's not going to be right in your face. It's not going to be on your TV. It's probably not going to be on your local radio station, but it's out there. You can find it, and these bands need your support, because we can't do a movie like this 20 years from now if nobody plays new bands now. I've heard new young bands that are phenomenal, and nobody seems to care. And I try my darndest to play them on my radio show, talk about them, tell people, and told people 100 times, hey, you're going to Black Sabbath, great young new band, newish band opening for them called Rival Sons. Get there early, go see them. They're opening every Sabbath date, because there's a band that's a newer band that totally channels a 70s vibe. But here in America, they still can't get they're not getting anywhere. Gonna go see AC/DC? Get there early. There's a band called Tyler Bryant and the Shakedown opening. Young guys from Nashville, killer band. Does the connection happen? Hasn't yet. So it's really frustrating, and I don't think it's any indictment on the quality of the bands. I think it's just the times that we're in. I just think that people are way more passive about it because they've got so many other things going on. I just met somebody recently who told me that the hologram technology is becoming very popular. You saw Tupac at Coachella a few years ago, a virtual hologram of Tupac. I know for a fact that's being looked at and considered for development for iconic rock artists. So these guys will live on forever. The fact that we've lost so many iconic artists like Glenn Frey, like David Bowie, like Prince. Listen, somebody said, and I don't know who or where, but some artists are even bigger in death than they are when they're alive. And I think that these guys passing away has even fueled their status as classic rock icons even more. So I think look what happens when these guys die. Their records, all of a sudden Prince had like 5 records on the charts at the same time. I never understood that, by the way. It's like, if you were a fan when they were alive, why didn't you have those records already? I never quite understood that whole phenomenon, but that's another story. But no, I mean, what you're seeing now is artists trying to find a way to live forever. Because what they're finding is that the brand is bigger than the band. And it's not always so much who's in the band. It's all about, hey, can we still sell this?
Still believe in the power of rock and roll music.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkisian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.
I hate that guitar, but I can play that in one scale.
Don't you dare laugh! You know, I try to embrace the rock and roll spirit in the sense of I do everything self-funded and independently made with no oversight. As such, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for watching.